that we'll use throughout the year describing how the human body is oriented or shaped or facing. So let's jump into it. We'll have lots of practice. I don't expect you to watch this video and be an expert by any means, but stick with the process. Do the practice over the next few days and we'll be good. Alright, so we're going to start off with not the human body. Here's a map of the boroughs in New York City. You can see the label, the red's the Bronx, blue Manhattan, and so forth. And directional terms on the human body are comparing one part of the body to another, just like in this map. So if I were looking at, let's say, it says Staten Island, the purple thing down here. And we're going to use terms that we're going to learn soon about the human body. We would say it's inferior to blue, which means lower, or south of, if we're talking directions like on a map. And lateral, which means further away from the middle. We'll learn that too, so don't worry. To practice, queens here in orange would be blank to the yellow. Hopefully we know it's north or further up, and the fancy word for that we're going to learn soon will be superior. So let's jump right into it. First things first, the anatomical position is how this gentleman is standing. He's standing straight up, his face is forward, his arms are at his side, and his palms are facing forward. That's considered the anatomical position. We see some of these arrows here are remember, they're describing parts. So it says superior, or cranial, because cranial means cranium, which is the head, is the top half. And the inferior, or caudal, which is like tail, is the bottom half. But it also can describe position related to another part. So let's just say we want to compare his chest with his chin. Well, if we start with the chin, we could say the chin is superior, further north, further up, further closer to the head than the chest. Or we could describe it the opposite, is that the chest is inferior or lower toward the bottom half than the chin. So again, these are comparison terms. All right. We have medial and lateral, which we see right here. Medial means like the median, the middle. So these parts are closer to the middle of the body. Lateral would be further away from the middle of the body. So if I cut the body in half and you're closer to that line, you're medial to something that is further. For instance, if we take this guy's shoulder and his sternum, which is the bone in the middle of his chest. Well, the bone in the middle of his chest, the sternum, is closer to the middle, so it is medial to the shoulder, or the shoulder is lateral compared to the sternum. Let's skip proximal and distal for a second, and dorsal and ventral, and go to the other one we're going to use the most today, and that is anterior versus posterior. You might have heard the term posterior, like think it's, oh, you land on your posterior, it's your butt. Well, it's the back side. So the posterior is more to the back of your body, the anterior is more to the front. It's kind of alphabetical. You start in the front, A, the back is P. So anterior, posterior. And again, it compares parts. So the knees are anterior to the ankles. The ankles are posterior to the knees. So let's kind of look at those here in a second in more detail after we tell you two more positions. Again, the anatomical position, we said standing upright, palms facing forward. Here, if you're lying face down, like the guy on the bottom, that is considered to be prone. Notice supine would be his face is up. So if we look at this crazy girl on the stairs, she is facing down, she's lying on her stomach, so she would be considered prone. All right, now let's analyze those terms that we kind of went over, but more details. Superior versus inferior. Sometimes we said on the other page too, we'll call it cranial because cranial means the head, which would be at the top. Caudal means the tail, which would be more toward the bottom. And again, we just have to start memorizing and practicing. So we will practice a lot. But anything that is closer to the top, toward the head, is superior or cranial compared to the stuff that's further away from the head, which would be inferior or caudal. So the head is obviously superior to the feet. The feet are inferior to the head. Oops, I almost gave an answer here. Here's an example. It says the hips are blank to the head. Well, the hips would be here. The head is here. So since the hips are lower, they're considered inferior. And blank to the knees. Well, in comparison to the knees, the hips are up higher. The knees are down here, so the hips are taller or superior. So the hips are inferior compared to the head because they're lower, but they're superior to the knees because they're higher than the knees. Medial and a lateral. Remember, medial we said means toward the middle. Lateral is further from the middle. So the navel, the belly button, is blank and blank to the hips. So now we're trying to combine both terms. So my belly button would be somewhere around here, my hips here. So the navel is higher, so it's superior, and it's closer to the middle, so it's medial. The shoulders, compared to the navel, the shoulders are higher, so they're superior, but they're further away from the middle, so they are lateral. That's how these fill in the blanks work. All right. So another set that we have to remember that are paired. Remember, superior and cranial are the same thing. Inferior and caudal. Well, anterior is the front. Posterior is the back. But we have another word. Anterior goes with ventral. I always remember AV because AV meant audio-visual, at least when I was growing up. Dorsal, you might think of like a shark or a dolphin. Their dorsal fin is on their back, so that might be the way to remember it. But, again, anterior is front, so is ventral. Posterior is back, and so is dorsal. So, let's see here. The spine. The spine would be here. The heart would be in the chest cavity. So the spine is further back. Further back is posterior or dorsal. And then it says the heart is blank to the ribs. Well, the ribs are up front. The ribs protect the heart. So the heart is behind or posterior to those ribs. Sorry, click something crazy. There we go. Proximal and distal are confusing for many. Proximal means closer to the origin of a body part or the attachment of a limb. So we tend not to use them for stuff in here. It tends to be parts that are on your arms and legs. Distal means distance. It's further from that attachment. So if you look here, it says the black arrows are proximal because they're closer to where everything would attach on the arms or legs. And then the white arrows represent distal because they would be further from those attachment points. So let's see if we can tie those into here. The shoulder, circled here, is blank compared to the elbow. Well, the shoulder, if we follow that black arrow, is closer up here, so the shoulder is proximal to the elbow. The wrist would be out here, which would be further than the elbow, so that is distal. Don't worry, we will practice a lot of these. We're not going to have to know this, but just realize there are differences for animals since they stand on all fours. They have a different anatomical position, but don't want to confuse you. Just be aware it's different. Nope, not even going to bother. Skip right through that. All right, probably the easiest of these new terms would be superficial versus deep. If you've ever heard a superficial wound, just means you got a little scratch. It's just scratching the surface of your skin. Because superficial means outward or more toward the surface. And if you've ever had a deep wound, hopefully you haven't, that's cutting deep. It's like you need stitches and damage because it's further in. So the skin would be superficial to everything because it's on the outside. And then everything else you'd compare down here. It says the ribs, while the lungs are blank to the ribs. Well, the lungs are behind the ribs, so they're deeper. You'd have to cut further to get to them, so they're deeper. The foot, we have to add something because the top of the foot is dorsal to the plantar, so a new region. The bottom of the foot is considered plantar. It would also be inferior, but when we're talking about the foot, we want to talk about plantar. Probably won't be on the test unless it's extra credit. The toenails are blank to the plantar version. Well, they're higher up, so that would be considered dorsal. All right, that's a lot. We're going to add one more little thing here, and that's planes of the body. So again, we're going to spend 2, 3, maybe longer if we need to, days just practicing these terms, getting better at them. And the planes of the body means basically if you cut them with a piece of glass. That's not what's happening, but if you vision them like that, that's going to be the best way. You can see here we have a coronal plane, a sagittal plane, transverse. We're going to get into those, so don't even bother memorizing. Just you can kind of see in the picture, some of the planes go one direction, different direction, and even a third direction, kind of your XYZ plane if you like math. So if you look here, this was a movie, pretty violent one. This guy got cut in half. But the question is, what kind of cut is this? Oops, sorry, I went the wrong way. So if we go back here, we can see he got cut like this. Right down his body right there. So that would be like the piece of glass that cut him, so that would be a coronal cut. Here, if you look here, it's hard to see maybe, but these people, here's a good example, blown up, got cut across. Well, let's go back and practice what that is. Across the cut we drew like this, so it would be a transverse plane here. So a transverse cut. All right, let's go into the planes in detail one at a time to hopefully clear some of it up. The frontal plane, up and down, cutting from two pieces, and it's cutting it between the front and back or between the anterior and posterior. So the front is the frontal plane is kind of easy to remember because it separates the front and back. So it tells you with its plain name, frontal, which way it cuts. Again, A goes with C. Before A went with V. Both times it was anterior and ventral. In the plain version, AC goes with coronal. Again, I'm going to try to stick with one term and then maybe use the other as extra credit on the test. But the frontal plane cuts between the front and the back, or divides the body between the front and the back. Sagittal plane, if you look here now, it's dividing between left and right. Now, if you really know anatomy, the middle of your top of your head is called the sagittal sutures. And probably doesn't help us, but we'll see it eventually, and maybe that'll help us remember. If you're cut the body right perfectly in half, left and right, it's called a mid-sagittal plane. Any other plane that is still left and right that's not off the center is called parasagittal, meaning if I cut here, it's still left and right. If I cut here, still left and right. So anything not perfectly middle is called parasagittal. We're not going to really focus on that. For us, sagittal, we're going to be referring to the middle of it, which is mid-sagittal. Transverse, well, let's see. We've cut front and back, left and right, but we have not cut up and down, top and bottom, and that's what the transverse plane is going to do, and that's also called a cross-section. You'll see some cells that were cut this way this year. So it divides upper and lower, which let's start using our fancy words, superior up, inferior down. So what I want you to do here is, on your note guide, pause and tell me each picture that's in your note guide, like do it now. don't just fast forward through the rest of this. You're going to, on the back page or the bottom half of your note guide, you're going to look at all these pictures and tell me, hey, what kind of cut is that? For instance, the way this is being cut, left and right. What is a left and right cut? So pause here while you fill all those out. And we'll go through one by one. Remember, sagittal is left and right. Mid-sagittal is what this specifically is, but we said don't worry about that, sagittal. This one is top and bottom, and we said a top and bottom cut is transverse. This one would cut it into a front and back, and we said front and back would be frontal, the easiest of those three. Now this one's tricky. If you look here, this is a heart, and it was kind of chopped where you could see, just like this one. If you missed this, don't worry, you're not experts on the heart yet, but this is also a transverse cut. And this, it's a little easier. You can see he was cut in half between left and right, so that would be mid-sagittal, or sagittal is fine if you put that. Now, I forgot to put the note guide in here, so I'm going to put it up now, the whole thing at once. Go ahead and pause it, copy the one part. Pause it for this part. And this part was in the video, so just double check that you're good here. You should be. If not, you can rewind and get these answers. And you are done.